Hi, I'm Alexa. I'm here with some of my favorite books. Most of what I read is about craft politics, and I often get asked to share some resources about how to learn more. So consider this your reading list. I got interested in learning more about the intersections of craft and politics because I am a crafter. It's a part of my hobbies. It's now a part of my career, a big part of my community, and I just feel like craft, because it's often done in community and because there's such a long history of people gathering together to create craft and specifically create it for their communities, that it's such an essential and interesting space to have conversations about political action. I'm specifically a knitter, crocheter, sewist, so fiber art is really interesting to me. I got into that. I started learning more about slow fashion and the sustainability implications of craft became really important to me and a part of my politic. Craft has historically been women dominated in a place where there's a lot of opportunity for queer expression. So I think it's also a space where there are a lot of interesting conversations about feminism and queer liberation. Because craft is so connected to communities and cultures, there's also a lot of issues of decolonization, how we talk about crafts and visual work from different places, how it's preserved. I've learned a lot about these further political topics through being involved in craft and taking this next step to educate myself on all of that. When I say craft is political, I'm talking about the communities that surround craft. Craft is a space where historically people have made things that are both beautiful and useful for the people in their communities. And I think a big part of stepping into political consciousness is understanding the ways that the things that are happening to you personally and that are happening to people in your communities are affected by larger systemic issues. Understanding that connection is essential before you can take any sort of action or implement political consciousness into your life. And these books have been personally really formative to me in making that connection, educating myself. I'm going to go through some of the books that have been most formative to me in understanding craft and politics. If you've watched my videos in the past, you've probably seen me talk about many of these. At the end of each of my vlogs, I talk about what I'm reading, and like 80% of it is craft politics books. If you're interested in this topic, stick around because there will be plenty more afterwards, but I would say these are the ones that I've read over kind of like maybe the last 2-3 years that I've been really interested in this, and I see them as a prime text to like get into this and understand the issues. Next up is The Subversive Stitch, Embroidery and the Making of the Feminine by Rosika Parker. This book is kind of considered a classic in the niche craft politics space. When I first started talking about this was like the most well-known book and one that a lot of people were recommending, and I understand why it gets so many people into this topic. So it specifically talks about embroidery, but I think it's really relevant to all crafts because it talks about the difference between fine art and craft. And I think when it comes to craft politics, that's one of the biggest issues that we see is the way that fine art and craft are valued differently, whether that's monetarily or in culture, different kinds of people who are allowed access into those spaces, who learn how to do those skills. This book does a really good job of laying out when that happened and using embroidery to explain when the separation of fine art and craft, who it affected. In this case, spoiler alert, women. It's the feminist text that talks about how throughout history, and I will say it is Eurocentric, like this is a lot about Western history, womanhood has been really intertwined with embroidery. Learning how to do embroidery and other like fiber crafts was some of the first education that was accessible to women. Of course, men were learning things like how to read and write and be literate and be like citizens, but embroidery was considered something that was very essential to being a woman. It wasn't just a hobby. It was thought about as something that reflected a lot about your morality. Are you patient? Are you able to sit there for hours and work on, you know, making something that reflects a biblical scene? A lot of different pictures of embroidery in here, and one of the things that I found really interesting was thinking about embroidery as a primary source into women's lives throughout history. One of the political issues with craft that's discussed at length in here is the fact that women were often not writing about their lives. That wasn't something that was being documented in the way that male lives were. One of the few physical primary sources we have about what women's lives were back, you know, way back when, is the crafts that they were making. And so things that you see in their embroidery can tell us a bit about what their lives were like, what their attitudes were at the time, what they were up to. So it's a really important historical document, and I think really intertwined with the history of politics and feminism, the fact that what survived of many women was their embroidery, which I find super interesting and relevant. The subversiveness of the stitch comes in with some of the examples that the author shares, which are about times when women took this medium embroidery that they were kind of subjected to. You know, a lot of women weren't doing it because they thought it was like a cool hobby that they wanted to do, it was expected of them, and they found some clever ways to subvert that, whether it's in the imagery that they made, maybe making embroidery that kind of pushed back against the political sentiments of the time and doing it in the medium that they were subjected to. I just think that's pretty badass and interesting. Consumed by Arja Barber is a recent favorite of mine. I really enjoyed reading this, and I feel like this is one of my favorite just like approaches to the conversation about sustainable fashion that I've read so far. The title is Consumed: The Need for Collective Change, Colonialism, Climate Change, and Consumerism. The book starts by making it very clear what the relationship of the modern fast fashion industry is to colonialism. The current fashion system wreaks economic havoc on traditionally pillaged countries. Terrible trade policies, dumping toxic waste, of course, like terrible unethical labor practices and environments. All of this relates directly to settler colonialism. Talks a lot about the white saviorism that is involved when we say things like, oh, well, it's a good job in that country, or this idea that without Western intervention, economies in traditionally pillaged countries would absolutely collapse. She makes it very clear that traditionally pillaged countries had very effective, well-run economies before Western intervention. Continuing to make these countries economically dependent on the West is not an act of charity, it's just colonialism. So I learned a ton from that, and also really appreciated the second half of the book is more about interrogating your own personal relationship to consumerism. And she really pushes the reader to take a hard look at themselves and be like, yes, like not all of us have everything accessible to us, but it is your responsibility to think about truly what state you are in, what resources you have at your disposal, and what the most sustainable decision you can make as a result of those resources is. There's a lot of actionable prompts and questions to think about, and it really helped me think about what I want to kind of engage with as my consumer ethic going forwards. Where Next by Claire Press, I had so much fun reading this. Like, I remember very clearly the couple of weeks that I was reading this, and I just loved having it in my bag and like pulling it out wherever I was. About the future of fashion, each chapter interviews a different designer or scientist or journalist, someone who's working on sustainable fashion. They talk about the solutions that they're coming up with to make the fashion industry more sustainable. It's a very hopeful book that's full of very real solutions, which is what was so fun to read about it, because there are so many inventive, cool things that are going on, and the book talks about just like we need to invest in them because they're out there. There are people who are doing this work. There are people who are innovating this. It also does a great job of breaking down what the current sustainability issues is. So it will kind of explain, you know, this is how the system is currently run. This is what's wrong with it. And then here are some people who are working on solutions. I also thought it was really holistic view. So it talks about the entire life cycle of garments in the fashion industry. Not just was this created in a sustainable way with sustainable materials, but what is the kind of end of life idea here? Like, what are we going to do with this piece when it gets old or damaged or out of style? Like, really thinking about the entire fashion system and what we need to do to make it more circular. Definitely one of my favorite reads on sustainable fashion. Again, just coming from such a like kind, hopeful place and presenting really actionable solutions. I love it. Aesthetics of Excess, The Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment by Dr. Jillian Hernandez. This text has been maybe the most formative of all these books to me. I don't have it here because I keep it in my art studio. I'm obsessed with it. I often pick it up to flip through for different things that I've written notes about or underlined. I love this book with a passion. I'll preface by saying this is a very dense academic text. It's a research project that was done on Black and Latina women in the Miami area. Gather together, make art together, talk about their presentation and how it informs their politics. The presentation that they're talking about is a lot of heavy, gaudy makeup, jewelry, a lot of things that, especially on women of color, are considered signs of being low class or low intelligence, and this book really flips that on its head and talks about how this is actually an incredibly politically engaged way to present yourself, about all the culture and history that it connects to, and also calls out fine art spaces for the ways that it co-opts this aesthetic. These are aesthetics that are often seen as undesirable when it's happening in poorer areas, but when it's being put up in a white cube gallery, it's like edgy and cool, so they really call that out. I thought the research like methodology of this book was also incredible. It was all based around conversations that are had with people while they're creating things, and I just think that shows how much of a conduit for conversation craft can be, and building communities around craft, how effective they can be, how it's such an essential part of being politically engaged. So I loved reading about that. It can be a bit hard to get your hands on because it is a academic text. I know that in the past when I've recommended it, people have said they've had some trouble. I got it directly from the publisher, and at this point that was like multiple years ago, so I'll check and see if I can get a good link going too. I know it's also about like where in the world you are and where it will ship to. I always recommend for any of these books, but maybe particularly for this one, to check if there are any libraries near you who might have it. Decolonized Museums by Shimrit Lee is absolutely amazing. Museum studies is something that I've in the past maybe like 5 years or so gotten super interested in. I took a really interesting course about it in university. I had no idea how much controversy there was around museums and how many different political conversations are happening there. Modern museums are such a site of discourse. There's so much to learn there, and it's a part of so many different conversations. I really recommend learning more about it, and I think this book does a great job of laying out kind of the political landscape of museums. Of course, we're connecting to the history of fine art and craft, maybe fine art versus craft in a way when we think about museums, how they present things. There's a lot of politics there. This prevailing idea that museums are neutral spaces, that they just put things out on shelves and people come look at them to learn, and that's really not the case. Obviously, everything has a context, and this author really argues that it's important that museums give context, have a point of view, take a stance on things. Talk about decolonized museums. It's important to know that museums are rooted in colonialism. This was a history that I was not really aware of before beginning to study this, but museums started because people who were colonizing other places would loot and take objects back to their homes and basically show them off to their friends to be like, look at all of these things that I've conquered. Eventually that became more public exhibitions where publicly artifacts from pillaged countries were being shown as kind of a way to encourage the public to be so proud of the empire that their country was building. And these artifacts are still in collections. The British Museum, the Met, they all have pillaged objects in their collections right now. And repatriation is the process of giving artifacts back to the places that they came from. And this book does an amazing job of breaking that conversation about what's happening with that in the modern day. A lot of traditionally pillaged countries have asked for their objects back. Some of them have been returned. Some of them have been returned temporarily. Museums are quite engaged with this process. Some museums are not at all engaged and have lots of different excuses and reasons why things should not be sent back to their home countries. And the museums decide what lives on, what history is taught, what people get to see as important from historical cultures. It's very political how these stories are told, how these objects are presented, and I really appreciated how this book broke it all down, made it very accessible, and opened up so many different conversations about how that's happening right now. This long thread, Women of Color on Craft, Community, and Connection by Jen Hewitt. This book platforms the voices of women of color in the craft community and talks about their experiences engaging with craft. It's a really big book, and there's a bunch of different interviews and essays from people. There are surveys. The author talks to a bunch of different people who do craft professionally, people who have just done it as a hobby, people who are talking about how craft is present in their different cultures and how they've engaged with craft, who taught them craft, talk about personal practices, family history, and it's just a really intimate, beautiful look at why craft is important to people in different ways. I felt like as I was reading this, I was constantly like pulling different things up on my phone because people were referencing so many different events or books or patterns or artists or just people who had influenced them. So it's like you're learning about all these people's personal relationship to their craft, but on top of that you learn what has influenced them, and then you have all these references. Like, this is just a treasure trove of so many cool things to look into the craft community. An absolutely amazing find for me has been Common Threads Press, which is an independent press that publishes books and zines all about craft history. So there are all these small, very accessible books that are on different topics. They'll have different authors who are experts in this area. Last year I was slowly collecting kind of like everything they have in their collection. I'm missing a few now because they actually just came out with a few things, so I'll have to get those. But I think this is the most amazing idea, and it has been so fun to read these. Again, like a perfect size to throw this in your bag and be learning about craft on the go. But I feel like a lot of the titles speak for themselves just about like how interesting the stuff they put out is, so I'm just gonna read through the ones that I have here. Stitching the Intifada, Embroidery and Resistance in Palestine, Diasporic Threads, Black Women, Fiber and Textiles, Slow-Grown Plants, Folklore and Natural Dyeing, Many Hands Make a Quilt, Short Histories of Radical Quilting, Stitching Freedom, Embroidery and Incarceration, Rights Not Charity, Protest Textiles and Disability Activism. Like, honestly, that's a reading list for you right there. There's so many interesting and important topics there, so I really recommend checking out Common Threads Press. Recently interviewed Laura, who is the founder of Common Threads Press, about what it was like to start this, begin putting out books, like the process of how they make this happen, and I just think it is such a lovely thing to be invested in. So support Common Threads if you read Material Girls magazine, which is the fiber art magazine that I run. That interview is going to be in the next issue, and there's a little discount code in there, so go looking for Material Girls magazine if you'd like to invest in some Common Threads. And speaking of Material Girls, I will say if you are interested in craft politics, I think this is a great place for you to be. So this is a craft magazine that I put out quarterly. It's always free to download, but you can also subscribe to the print editions as well if you want. I design a knitting, crochet, and sewing pattern in each one, interview different makers, and the whole aesthetic is just like very high femme, pink girly. I mentioned it in this video because in the latest issue I started a column that is now going to be recurring that is all about craft politics and what that means for the modern material girl. So in the first one I wrote a bit about what craft being political means to me, and then recommended a bunch of books, most of which I have also just recommended to you. In the future I'm really excited to share other resources just to like learn more about craft politics and get engaged, get educated. Just after this video goes out, the 12th issue of the magazine will go out, so there's plenty to engage with there, and hopefully a place to watch if you want to keep learning more about these things. Those are my top tips for craft politics books. I have lots of other book recommendations, and I'll link my bookshop down below, along with of course links to each of these books. But Bookshop is a great website where you can shop for books online, but the money supports small business bookstores. You can either choose to support a specific bookstore that you know and you want your money to go directly to, or you can just generally shop on the website and they will disperse the money amongst all participating bookstores. So I think that's super great, and I keep all of my book recommendations up there. Thank you so much for watching. It makes me really happy that people are interested in this topic as well. When I first got into it, I felt like it was quite niche, and I've since realized that there's actually a large community of people who are engaged with these things, and so I love learning from people, hearing recommendations. If you have another book or resource you think I should try out, then let me know in the comments down below, and stay tuned to see what I'm reading next.